Hello, everybody. Hi. Good afternoon, and thank you for coming today. I hope everybody's had a good conference so far. Yes? Okay, great. I've had a great time too. Well, thank you. My name is Neka Emegwa. I'm part of Accenture Security, and today we are bringing you this presentation today. Well, actually, it's going to be just a discussion, just to talk about, the cloud and our journey to the cloud and how we can do that securely. So today, I'm joined by my colleague here who would introduce himself shortly. But I consider myself a cybersecurity consultant, as well as a networking and infrastructure practitioner. So I've been with Accenture for 13 years, and I do a lot of security work. So pleasure to be here today, and I'm joined by Dan. So do you want to introduce yourself?
Good afternoon as well. Thank you guys for joining this session. I hope it is interesting and informative. We're going to try to interweave a bunch of client examples and anecdotes from some of our experiences to allow you to hear about some of the lessons learned that we've had over the course of time, so that those are things that you might be able to take away and either repeat when they're good or not repeat when they're bad. But by way of introduction, I've been with Accenture for about 20 years. I look after our cloud security practice globally, and have done a bunch of deployments across all of the three major hyperscalers. So happy to share some of those learnings with you today.
Yeah, I think we're going to have some questions at the end. We'll keep time for questions, so feel free to, shoot us some questions. Do you want me to? Okay, so we thought about just, again, walking us through what the journey to the cloud looks like. Accenture, we've been doing cloud work, a lot of cloud migrations for quite a while now. And so we thought that we should make sure that our security practitioners know how we do that securely, make sure that security is part of the whole journey for our clients. And so we actually started looking at where we've been over the past few years. So I was listening to the keynote today, and I heard the guy from ABN AMRO. He talked about their journey, right? How they started, they were at waterfall, and then moved into agile, and now looking to do DevOps. And so, if you guys remember the whole journey, right? Some decades back, we started with the mainframe and our shared libraries, and trying to scale that was a little bit difficult, right? But we started moving into the physical hosts and started looking more into how do we make that even more scalable as well as cost effective, and then started looking into this era of the cloud. And so here we are with the cloud, with the virtual machines, looking into more of using microservices to bring our business services to market faster and our applications. And so even from there, looking into the future of how we can use more of the services from the cloud around like serverless or, your event-driven architectures. So that's kind of where we are now. How do we move? We've got to the cloud, how do we enable that securely? And then how do we move to make sure we're using the cloud optimally and cost effective?
Yeah, and I think one thing I'll just plug in there is I think the journey to cloud is very much like a lot of the other technological progressions that we've seen over the course of time. And what I mean by that is security hasn't necessarily been integrated into what we're doing as a part of cloud migrations natively, right? So by default. And I think we've seen evidence of that in terms of how the CSPs have brought security services, so native security services, to market. So those were certainly done post some of the business and functional services. So it's almost like we want to make sure we don't repeat the same mistakes that we've made over the course of some of the trends that Neka's mentioned just now. And I think we'll look at some of the ways to ensure that we're doing that properly.
Yep. So in addition, 94% of enterprises are or have a cloud strategy, right? Are using the cloud right now. So let me take a quick poll. 3 questions. So the first is, who here works for an organization which is, or owns one, which is currently not using the cloud, has no workloads running in the cloud, not intending to use the cloud, and just zero cloud? Anybody? Oh, okay, one person, interesting. Thank you.
So no SaaS, no PaaS,
No SaaS, no
infrastructure.
PaaS, no IaaS,
All right.
no cloud. No what?
No fun. Right,
Okay,
no.
cool. And then, okay, so who here is kind of in the middle? You've started to use the cloud, or you have a cloud strategy, or you have some workloads out there. Maybe you have a combination of on-prem too, but you are definitely using the cloud for some of your workloads. IaaS, PaaS, SaaS. Okay, great. I think most people.
And of those hands, how many have production workloads in the cloud? Okay. Good majority of them. Good.
Okay, anybody here that is all cloud first, like all cloud and nothing else? Everything is in the cloud. I see, okay.
Folks in
Two
the back,
hands.
yep.
Wow, a couple of hands. That's awesome. So I think one thing we've learned for Accenture is that our clients are at various levels of the cloud. It's not really a matter of when, if. It's when, and how do they do that securely. So hopefully today's discussion will help you see how we approach that from our point of view. But yeah, I think this shows pretty well that lots of people are thinking about the cloud. But in addition to that is, lots of enterprises want to adopt the cloud, but we've seen that security is the key challenge for them. So there was a poll taken, and yes, most of them said, in fact, security was the number one thing that was top of mind for the C-suites. I mean,
Yeah, that's security, privacy, compliance. When you look at the polls over the course of time, it's been the number one or number two inhibitor associated with moving to the cloud. And one of the things that I've found is that a lot of times the business wants to move, and security practitioners aren't educated on what needs to be done in the cloud. So, the business gets frustrated. The business wants to move fast. The business wants to release new products. They want to take things to market. And security saying, we think you should have X, Y, and Z, which may or may not even relate to what the business is trying to do. So I think there's a disconnect between security and kind of the core foundation knowledge level that's required for security to be successful. So there's a bit of a mindset shift that has to happen as a part of this. As security practitioners, we need to go on that journey with the business.
all right, hopefully that's resonating. Amit yesterday talked about, at his keynote, he talked about the shared responsibility. And, I was glad he mentioned that, because that's kind of what creates all these gaps. Like our clients not really understanding what is their responsibility as opposed to what's the public cloud provider's responsibility. So we've seen that a lot of that caused these gaps that we're seeing driving the metrics here.
Yeah, and what I've seen is clients usually have one of two perspectives. They either say, oh, we're moving to the cloud. The provider tells us that the cloud's secure. We don't have to do anything, right? And so obviously as soon as you put something on top of what the provider provides you, it is no longer their responsibility, and in all likelihood, it is no longer secure. So, or the kind of the other end of that trust spectrum is nothing is secure. We don't trust the provider. We want to understand how we can implement controls that, in case there's a provider hypervisor vulnerability or something, we want to have protections to compensate for things that the provider might fail on. So it almost seems like there's people at opposite ends, very few people in the middle, but I think as folks mature, they start to understand that this is a joint effort from a security standpoint.
Yep, and you talked about joint effort. So we've looked at some considerations for the cloud for security. So a couple of things here. Obviously, as we move to the cloud, there's a lot more attack surface expanded, a lot more vectors, a lot more complexities we're dealing with. So how do you tackle all that, right? How do you make sure that you're all secure end to end? And obviously that also, so cloud is driving your digital transformation. Cloud is basically driving all your intelligent platforms. So how do you make sure that there's no security issues with that, vulnerability, things that will throw you out into the news shortly? So those are some key considerations. We also see that DevOps is a big one, right? The DevOps people are not quite talking to the security people, and so DevSecOps is a big discussion point right now. And just how to integrate and make sure we're all communicating together. The security people are talking to the business owners as well. So the people that own the applications and the users, and educating the users. So lots of considerations here. Do you want to add anything to this one?
Yeah, no, I think one of the complicating factors is when you look at the volume of cloud services that are released. And so a lot of security shops start this process and they say, okay, there are these core AWS, Azure, Google services that we want to use. And those should be requirements driven from the business, right? So application or business units want to do analytics in the cloud. And so therefore we need this set of services, say on Google. I think what you'll find is that security orgs want to have the controls for those services performed up front and then have some sort of validation that those controls stay in place and are operating as intended. Pretty common kind of perspective. The thing that we've seen over and over again is that core set of services, as soon as they start using those, there's adjacent services to all of those that they want to start using. And so then that expands the set of services that are in scope for security to have some sort of perspective on how to use securely. And what we find is that there's a pretty big gap in terms of the ability for security organizations to scale to meet those kind of service introduction demands. And so one of the things that we'll talk about in here is, as Neka mentioned, in terms of DevOps, is how do you start to automate some of that security so that as you're deploying services, you've got the right guardrails in place to at least have a degree of confidence that you're preventing inadvertent vulnerabilities or misconfigurations from exposing your data, your client's data, et cetera.
Yeah, and also we saw on the previous slide that the multi-cloud strategy, so that even makes it more complex. So 86%, I think we showed, of the enterprises are considering a multi-cloud. So that means it's a combination of, the cloud providers. It could also be a combination of on-prem, hybrid, as well as a public cloud. So how do you now provide that visibility across them? That's a key consideration. And also, if you want to use, you're using your SaaS, your IaaS, your PaaS, how do you provide a consistent security across all that? So that's a key consideration. All right.
So I think when you start to look at how we've looked at controls in the past and how we need to look at controls as we move forward, historically we kind of batched up. We need controls associated with the CISSP domains or some sort of ISO, NIST, some sort of security framework, right? And so these were things that we batched up linearly and deployed into environments, or frankly, we bolted on afterwards in terms of the deployment lifecycle. And what we're seeing is that in order for this to be effective, we need to have integration into that process. So we're deploying infrastructure as code. We should be deploying security as code alongside that infrastructure as code. And as we look at kind of the life cycle of applications, the life cycle of development, if everybody thinks about their phone and the number of updates you get to applications as a part of your weekly run, it's happening on a continual basis. And so security needs to be embedded, have the same mindset, releasing security features or security capabilities or security controls in that same kind of cadence. And so it's definitely something that needs to change. I think the other thing is, as we look at some of the advancements in some of the capabilities that are offered by the service providers, you can get native integration for various security controls, whether it's identity or monitoring, things that you couldn't necessarily do as quickly using third-party products. So it's another benefit of basically taking advantage of the speed at which the CSPs are iterating on security services and introducing those into the market. So if we take a step back and look at how this tends to materialize for clients, one of the things that we've seen be really successful within organizations is decomposing each of the different areas that a client needs to think about as a part of defining their security strategy. So Neka mentioned that a lot of clients are in a multi-cloud or have a multi-cloud strategy. I would argue that very few clients have an actual multi-cloud strategy. They just find themselves in a multi-cloud state. So the business has decided that they want to use Google for analytics. The corporate functions have decided that they want to use Azure for their .NET applications. Their development org has decided they want to use AWS for all net new dev. And so you get into the security, of course, security organization is stuck kind of in the middle of that motion, and they're trying to deal with all of these things and how they prioritize these things. And ultimately, the hope is that you get to some sort of risk-based decision approach in terms of how you deal with these things. But as you look at these different considerations, there are likely things that are going to change as a part of a security organization's security philosophy. So you may have an organization that's heavy in data protection, really robust, mature capabilities around key management, encryption, obfuscation, all of that stuff. One of the things that you may see change is that as you move things to the cloud, those requirements may shift, whether by regulatory or just internal policy. And so an easy example of that is tokenization. So we've got clients that didn't have tokenization requirements on premise, but in the case of one of our financial services clients, as they move any kind of critical financial data to the cloud, they want to have that tokenized. And so then you start to look at what are the capabilities natively to be able to tokenize data. Will that service from AWS scale to be able to support the kind of requirements, the throughput, the file sizes, et cetera, that we need to process? Or do we need to bring in a third-party product? And then from that third-party product, how are we going to integrate with that third-party product? How are we going to expose those services to the business or app dev teams that are going to be using those services? So there's a bunch of considerations that probably change as you look at your risk posture in moving to the cloud versus what you had on-prem. So I guess the next step is a part of once you've decomposed, prioritized these things, figure out where your focus is, maybe identified some investment areas, you start to look at how you reassemble this. And this is a little bit of an eye chart, but it's something that I kind of want to drive home is this is one of the anchor points for a lot of our clients that have been successful in this journey. And so cloud security reference architecture is something that we've developed over a bunch of different patterns. And so this is kind of a representative sample of them. We've got it for infrastructure as a service, for PaaS, and for SaaS. There's obviously things that are out of scope as you move up that stack. But the other main point here is you really have to get CSP, so you have to get cloud provider specific in order to be successful. So as you move left to right, we've got the general cloud security reference architecture, we've got the public version, then we've got the ones for each of the 3 major CSPs, there's others for Oracle, et cetera. But if you take the AWS reference architecture, drive one more step down into the technical instantiation. So how do these services, how are we actually going to use these services? And once you start looking at that, you start to see, oh, so wait a minute, there's a difference in terms of the feature set that I get from AWS, the feature set that I get from Google, the feature set that I get from Microsoft. The robustness of the data that you get from each of those services is different. So as you look at this will help to inform the strategy that you started out with on the previous slide and figuring out what those use cases are, and then to the 3 or 4 levels down, how you're going to actually implement those. How do you get to the outcomes that you want from a security requirement standpoint based on either native services, and we'll look at an exploded version of the AWS one in just a minute, but where do you need to plug in or augment with third-party products, perhaps, right? And so the example I mentioned before in terms of data protection, as you look at AWS KMS or Cloud HSM, if you're looking at Azure Key Vault and how you're going to architect something for application owners to use, or GCP KMS, right? Is that something that you're going to duplicate those controls each time you deploy something in one of those cloud environments? Or do you abstract that a level and say, all right, I'm going to do data protection through this third-party tool, and it's going to apply to each of these clouds. So I've got one place to define the policy. I've got one place to enforce that policy. I've got one place to make changes if I want to change how I'm going to do data protection across each of those environments. And in all likelihood, unless you've got a really strong governance process, that's going to work better than duplicating those, maintaining each of those kind of instances of that control. And that's only one control, right? Same thing could be said for monitoring. Same thing could be said for identity.
And even so, with the capabilities you've mentioned here, it's hard for our clients, right? Because even having the skills to do that for one cloud, not to talk of, we talked about multi-cloud, that's very challenging. So, having these reference architectures and just having the people to scale them is very difficult,
Yeah, no, it's a great point. And one of the other kind of really significant things that having a reference architecture like this will do is it gives you some consistency. So every conversation that you have with the business, with dev teams, with operations teams, is going to have the same elements in that conversation. So you've got a common taxonomy, a common nomenclature in terms of how you're talking about this, and hopefully the idea is that that'll drive consistent results in terms of what you're getting from a security posture standpoint. So this is a bit of an exploded view of the AWS version of this. So it houses all of the native AWS security services aligned to kind of the domains within this reference architecture. And then there's a bunch of security considerations over to the right. And these will change depending on the security philosophy of the organization. So I mentioned before, you may have folks that are super heavy identity shop. This identity box may be 3 times the size it is because they're focusing on dynamic secrets management. They're really focused on privileged user management and attestation, things like that. You may have others that are really heavy monitoring and incident response shops, and they really focus on the detect and respond areas, and those may be exploded out just because that's where their skill set lies. It's a great way to kind of heat map an organization to say, as we look at your readiness for cloud, you've got some white space in terms of the things that you're able to do today. And as you look at transitioned operations, either you don't have capacity to run your current security operations environment plus, what's coming, and you start to look at the volume of telemetry and things that come from some chatty cloud services, and that can be a really significant uplift for a lot of security operations organizations. So, we've done heat maps on this. We've done kind of maturity assessments using this, and it really helps a client to think, methodically through what they need to do to be ready for what's coming. I think, as Nneka mentioned, if you take this, my right, your left-hand side, and consider just the 3 hyperscalers. You have a set here for AWS. You'd have another set for GCP. You'd have another set for Azure. And then starting to pick and choose the native services you're going to use. And then you start to look at the maturity of the services. And so if I pick on Microsoft, sorry for any Microsoft folks in the room, but if I pick on Microsoft and you look at what you get from a feature standpoint from Azure Firewall, is that going to provide you parity with what you see on premise if you've got Palo, and you've got Panorama, and you've got visibility to the nth degree and different capabilities from a malware detonation standpoint? And so no, it's not going to. Is that something you're willing to give up from a speed or agility standpoint? That's probably a debate between the business, the app dev teams, and the security teams. So
definitely we want you to use the native securities and use them in the right way. But there's also understanding if that covers you completely and making sure that you can use it properly. And also, if you're extending this to your on-prem data center, your private cloud, how do you do that extension, right? First is the multi-cloud, and then extending that to your on-prem cloud too. So those are key considerations too, especially if you're considering like a zero trust approach, and then you start to think of where does identity play. How do you integrate with your ADs and so on? So it can get complex, but this starts to help and shows you where to start from, I guess. Yeah.
Yeah, I think the other it's a great point, and when you start to look at private cloud, public cloud, you may have different security requirements depending on which of those environments you're talking about. And so then you're going to get into discussions about, do I design for the low water line for each of those environments, and then I have different configurations depending on if I'm talking private or public, or do I define for kind of the high water line and say, I'm going to have this consistent security across every environment. I don't care if it's private dev, if it's public test, it doesn't matter. This is where we're at. And that obviously has probably some cost implications and some operational implications, but it does simplify to some degree the conversation and some of the controls that you'll be looking at. So this one is just a kind of another example. If we take network security as the use case for what we're trying to do, there's a bunch of things that you can layer natively And if we talk about AWS again, for instance, from a DDoS standpoint, it's one of those things that you kind of get by default from the providers. So if there's some sort of activity associated with your tenant and they're seeing high volumes in the terabyte per second type of range, there's obviously an external attack going on. This is really, click button if you've got Shield Advanced. Excuse me, it can help you both on inbound and outbound. So this could also be a means for identifying some sort of auto-scaling runaway process that you've got in your environment. So there are cost protections associated with some of these things as well that could be extremely useful. VPC isolation is another one that's a very simple kind of button click means for isolating apps, for isolating data, for isolating compute instances. Can be super useful for levels of protection. And then native WAFs. So it provides a kind of an exterior protection for applications that are either internally exposed or externally exposed. Network access control lists and security groups, I think when you use those two in conjunction, you get a lot of the features of both stateful and stateless firewalls. There's complexities associated with really large-scale environments as you look at how do you manage policies across a really large and maybe diverse cloud estate. So definitely some heavy lift there if you find yourself in a really large-scale deployment. And then kind of these blue boxes ahead of or above the native services. We mentioned before there's going to be gaps either in security requirements, either security features, that are going to necessitate third-party products. So you may have some sort of external DDoS / content acceleration capability from the likes of Akamai or others. You may have some sort of network virtual appliance or firewall. You may have VM series from Palo in play. And then you may have other things like host-based firewalls, AV, file integrity monitoring, and things that you have to have in place based on either regulations that apply to your organization or just internal kind of security risk tolerances. So just an example of if you took one of those boxes on the previous reference architecture and kind of blew it out to say, these are places where we can use native services, and these are places where we're going to augment with third-party products.
I think we are preaching consolidation too, because with the whole complexity, nobody wants to throw in an extra, thing in there in the network. So the more you can consolidate or find a vendor that provides it all, the better for you. You use a native security, but what do you augment with that? And can you get that from basically one source? I think you'll be better off that way. We also talked about using the microservices, the containers, the serverless. So all those you need to also consider how you can securely use them and if the native securities are sufficient for you.
Yep, all definitely good points. I think the other interesting thing with regards to VPC isolation, when you start to talk about if there is a security event, right, from an incident response standpoint, do you have the mechanisms in place to contain kind of the blast radius associated with whatever threat is trying to perform bad things in your environment? So yeah, I think there's lots of really interesting elements associated with this. And Nneka mentioned kind of multi-cloud. If we stick with this network example, if you think about Azure, so they had something called UDR, which is user-defined routing. So I could basically specify where the traffic was going to flow between different VNets in that Azure subscription. For a long time, AWS didn't have that. So we saw people basically creating transit VPCs, right? And then they would have a Palo VM series sit in there and they could do inspection of that traffic. So you could see east-west traffic. They've now rolled out things like transit gateways, right? And so basically, how are these environments, the services evolving? How does that change your approach to securing those environments? You may not put a VM series in that transit VPC now. You may just have it at the edge. So there's, basically one of the points is there's so many changes. Things are rapidly iterating from the CSP standpoint in terms of services and architectures that you can use. It's kind of a constant churn in terms of what is the right security architecture based on the available services. All right. There's going to be a quiz on this one later. No. So this is an eye chart. I apologize for that. But this is just a sample view of kind of the process and tooling approach to injecting security in a CI/CD pipeline, right? So there's a bunch of different places where you perform different security functions, whether it's code that you have developed that is sanctioned by security that you inject into the front end of this. So we mentioned guardrails before. And so, there's a means for having like a security SDK, and you would release the security SDK to application development teams. This security SDK allows them to not have to worry about coding monitoring routines or identity routines. They can pull these things that security has sanctioned, that security has pre-tested, and ideally it shortens their development lifecycle, right? They don't have to worry about some of the functions that they traditionally had to develop. So the other places you've got library scanning, you've got static code scanning. The one admonishment, the one warning I would give, a part of, everybody talks about shifting left, and I would say blindly shifting left doesn't work. And the thing that we've seen over and over again is security organizations get so hyped up on shifting left that they start to introduce a ton of noise into the system. And the same way your SOC analysts get alert fatigue, your developers who are not security practitioners who get reports about their code start to get the same kind of fatigue, right? Security keeps pounding me with stuff because they're running static code scans on every code commit that I do. You have to be really intelligent about where you start doing that and how you surface those findings. So if I'm doing static code scanning on commits in a sandbox or an innovation environment or something like that, does it make sense to really surface those and give those to developers? Do they care about it? Do we as security practitioners care about it? Maybe not. If those are isolated environments, it's probably not worth shifting left there, right? You're just going to introduce a lot of noise and a lot of angst into the system. Sure, for staging, for QA, for prod, clearly, definitely the right places to get visibility on anything that's vulnerable. I would say, development, like late stage development and testing environments are the right place to shift left. Anything before that, you're probably shooting yourself in the foot. So I think we'll just talk quickly about a specific client example. So there's a client that kind of spans health and financial services that we've been working with for a couple of years now, and we've gone on this journey with them. It started out as they called us in to do a policy review. There was another consultancy that was in doing some work for them. They just kind of wanted a gut check. So we did that review. That review led us into some security pattern and security control evaluations just to make sure that kind of what was defined in policy was actually being implemented. And what we found is that it wasn't, and when it was being done manually based on some like narrative documentation. So what we started to do was talk to this client about, how do you automate the security guardrails as a part of service introduction? So they've got an AWS environment. They've got a service catalog in AWS where they release services to developers to trial. They have to be sanctioned by security. So what we did is we helped accelerate the security control integration into each of those services. So before a service shows up in an AWS console or is exposed via API to their development shop, we implemented, threat and vulnerability management hooks. We implemented security monitoring hooks. We implemented identity, basically principle of least privilege controls around each of the services that they release. So I think at this point we've done 97 of the core AWS services that they're going to use as a part of what's coming in the demand channel from the business. So they've got security from the start for all of those different services. And then on the back end, we've basically written AWS config rules to do identification of deviations from that good known baseline. And then there's means for invoking some Lambda functions to auto-remediate any of the deviations. So there's a way to do things right up front. There's a way to actually control and understand any deviations from that. And there's a way to implement auto remediation for those in kind of a single environment. And that extended. So we started out doing this in CloudFormation templates. They've got a multi-cloud strategy. They want to extend this stuff to some of their Google usage. So we converted those CFTs into Terraform, and now we've got that same catalog for a slightly more generic set of controls that can be ported to, Google, to GCP. It was a tangent, but that kind of spawned off into some cloud access security broker work. So the likes of Prisma SaaS, and how do they govern data that's leaving their premise and going into SaaS environments. So data discovery, looking at some of the controls around, is the data protected adequately in those SaaS environments? And then we extended that to AWS as a second check for their audit function. And so what I mean by that is we have those security guardrails in place. We've got config looking at any deviations, and we've got Lambda auto remediating. And then we had basically the likes of Redlock ensuring that configuration is maintained from an audit standpoint. So they had kind of two different lenses that they viewed the same security control posture from. This particular organization is in a post-breach settlement commitment state. And so there's some really unique things that we had to figure out for them as a part of how they were going to operate. Database activity monitoring was one. It's a really challenging thing to do across different data services in the cloud, because it's not just databases where you've got a database engine. You've got different data services that don't resemble the same kinds of data services you would get from an Oracle database or another relational database. And so what this forced us to do is, how do you ingest different actions? If I create a new DBA, that's clearly a significant event based on that person's privileges. So how do I alert and confirm or validate that that's an accurate action, right? And similarly, if there's any sort of large data query or data export, I need to make sure that that is aligned to some sort of intentional action. Otherwise, there's potential for some sort of malicious data exfiltration or data exposure. Similarly, that tokenization, the comment I made early on in the presentation, where as this client moved to cloud, previously they did not have a tokenization requirement. As they moved to cloud, that became a requirement. So it was both mandated by some of their auditors and some of the post-breach agreements, and then became internal policy. So everything they push out has to have some sort of data tokenization filter applied to it. We also did container security. So this was a client that had deployed Twistlock. This client hadn't done a great job deploying Twistlock, and so we kind of came in, did a diagnostic, identified a bunch of Defender nodes that they had deployed that didn't have any container services running in the environment. So obviously from a licensing standpoint, Palo Alto might not like that very much, but we identified areas where they had deployed those Defender agents where there weren't container services, so no reason for those to be running. But there were also a bunch of features that they hadn't enabled, one, and then two, all of the output from Twistlock wasn't being processed by their security operations team. And so there's clearly significant impact if they're not actioning some of the output from the products. And then finally, kind of zooming out all the way, we put ServiceNow automation around everything. So their landing zone creation, the security associated with kind of all of the things that I mentioned before, account creation for innovation sandboxes, for dev, test, prod, staging. So just kind of the overarching automation to ensure that all of that security was deployed with those environments. I think we'll skip through this one. There's just, there's a handful of stages that you go through that have different outputs and potential accelerators. A couple of kind of takeaways, a couple of key success criteria, and we'll talk about another client example in a minute, but I think getting your alignment with your policy controls, and if I go back to the reference architecture diagram, so that reference architecture should kind of sit in the middle of everything you do. So upstream from that would be your standards, your guidelines, your policy, and ultimately your cloud security strategy. And then downstream from that reference architecture would be your use cases, your design patterns, and then the security automation or security code that you develop and provide to developers, or that you use internally as a security org to make sure that what you said you're going to do from a use case standpoint is actually implemented. And that's where that whole SDK, you bundle those security libraries into an SDK that you give to dev teams. They're happy, you're happy, everybody wins. The guardrails, so I mentioned getting the right security in place. If you understand what those use cases are, developing those guardrails is very simple. Having consistency based on that security reference architecture, make sure that all the components that you need are included in each of those guardrails. Visibility, probably one of the biggest concerns in cloud, not only from a cloud usage standpoint, but what's going on within those environments, and then concerns over if you're using PaaS services, is the right security being applied to the underlying infrastructure, et cetera. It's not the tenant's concern, but obviously as paranoid security practitioners, we still kind of worry about that stuff. And then automation. I don't think we shared a stat about the number of unfilled security jobs in the market forecasted to 2022 or something, but it's an obscene number. And so the way we break that headcount model is through automation. So as much of the process as you can automate, inject alongside the infrastructure as it's being deployed, the fewer people you need to do the implementation, the fewer people you need to manage it, the fewer people you need to do the operations. I think Nneka's probably got some points on partnership because she always does.
Yeah, so I think these are awesome. We feel that even maybe the first number one point there should be like having the right partner. So if you start your journey or you're thinking about your journey or you're already in that maturity somewhere along those lines, having the right partner who's going to walk you through what you need to do. So we've talked a lot about complexity. We've talked a lot about the skills shortage. And so who is the right partner for you in your cloud journey, not just for the security, but just the entire migration to the cloud? So this partner should be somebody also who can help you choose your right technology partner too. So you have somebody doing your SI and also helping you to choose what's best for you, right, for your environment. So is it, out of the 3 public clouds, which one should you go to first, or which one are you in and which one should you go to next? As well as we've talked about the gaps in the controls too. So, what are the right vendors to fill those gaps? So we think that the right partner is very key here.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. Kind of the who's got the battle scars or the experience to take you through that journey. Just talking about technology, Nneka, it reminds me of a client when you talk about selecting technology. The other thing that we've used that reference architecture for is to map tools. So everyone's got investments in a certain security stack, right? And so if I pick on something like DLP, because this is something we had a problem with, you've got a certain assumption around how data loss prevention is going to work in your environment. As you move to cloud and you start to think about how those environments are elastic and how those environments are somewhat ephemeral, you may spin up an environment at night, you may shut stuff down on the weekend because you're trying to save costs. If you think about DLP and agents reporting back to some sort of central DLP console, now you've got a whole different kind of scenario. You've got environments that have a ton of compute instances that are no longer reporting. So you either need to suppress those alerts, you need to change your process, or you need to at least have folks in an operational capacity that understand what's going on in those environments so that they're not raising flags about some sort of DLP violation, or they're not sending admins out to fix an environment that's intentionally shut down. So just things like that, just examples of situations like that. And we see that in almost all of the security domain areas where there's nuances around how things function in the cloud that are different than what we're accustomed to, the norms in an on-premise environment.
All right, so we just want to use the final few minutes we'll leave time for questions, but just to talk about the client case study. Dan has talked about one very detailed. I just want to extract that to 1,000 level foot and just talk about how we help the client migrate to the cloud. And so as Accenture, we actually have a big cloud migration group, Journey to Cloud group. And this particular client is a health insurance client, big one, provides insurance to thousands of clients or customers. And so they really brought us in to help them on that trip to the cloud because they had some business services they needed to enable, around, big data, using big data for it, using even IoT. So just seeing the cloud as an enabler for all that. And so what we did was we came in first and started to work with them around, what does that look like? What is the outcome they're expecting? So really it's around, ultimately, what is the business outcome they're expecting? And so we're able to put together a roadmap for them. We actually started to look at their current environment, assessed what it looked like, started to prioritize them. What are the key business units that we needed to target, the key business applications too. We also started to do some rationalization of the applications and looking at which ones needed modernizations and which ones needed to be rebuilt for the cloud. And from there, of course, having security embedded upfront, right, at the right time and all that. And so for them, it was really, look, we want to get the business services out there. We want to enable applications, but we want to just make sure that they're all secure. So we started to walk them through that journey. And it was a full transformation of their architecture and their infrastructure, really. But at the end of the day, we also put them on a cloud management platform where they now were able to get on with what they needed to do while we started to manage the platform for them. So you talked about lots of alerts and the fatigue and lack of skills, and so we're able to take on most of that for them, for this particular client. So I think at the end of the day, we're able to realize their outcome for them.
Yeah, and I think it's really interesting when you've got traceability from the security controls you implement and how those support a business outcome. And I think as security practitioners, right, we've got a responsibility to make sure that what we're doing is tied to business outcomes. And that was a really good example of where that was done kind of intentionally from the onset. And so justification for security investment in certain security capabilities, et cetera, wasn't a problem because we were tied to kind of higher order business outcomes that weren't, we weren't trying to justify through some sort of security ROI. So it was a really effective means for getting the right security embedded into the solution and the journey as they migrated.
All right, I think we can take questions for the last 5 minutes, 2 minutes. Any questions? Very clear? As clear as mud? Any questions? Yeah.
Thank you. I think you explained quite well the whole journey, but like you mentioned something about the lack of skills, and obviously I think it's one of the biggest problems when organizations are moving to the cloud. How you guys can help or tackle this specific problem?
Yeah, so I think, automation is the end goal, but getting to that point of automation is sometimes challenging. If you take, so I mentioned kind of the AWS services guardrails that we created for one client. If you take those and look at the acceleration that can give to a client's journey, it's pretty significant in terms of the time savings. Having those as a baseline that you actually educate security folks on to understand what's being done for EC2 and S3 and all these different services starts to build a little bit more awareness around what's required for each of those and what the capabilities of each of those services are. So it's kind of a kickstart to both getting the right security in and helping enable the security practitioners to grow in their knowledge and understanding of what's required for each of those services. So there's obviously consultative augmentation that we as a consulting firm that could provide. That's a short-term fix. Obviously, if you can enable an organization to grow and learn and reskill their folks or upskill their folks, that's the ultimate goal. But I think automation is another key component in accomplishing that. Good question.
Any other questions? Okay.
Thank you very much for your time. If you have any other questions you didn't want to announce in front of everybody else, you feel free to come up to the front.
Thank you.